Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson. I want to influence youth today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. You're on the border in your horizon, maybe get you to university. Um, anyway, you come in to a bit of a midlife crisis, perhaps, being a middle-aged person, deterioration of your body. You want to do something that you can find that's amicable, something that can look after your mental health, your well-being. Sometimes change is well needed, having a vision. Anyway, we're on A225 Block 1, the Open University. We're going to reference our reading Ambition and Anxiety, 1789 to 1840. This book is edited by Paul Lawrence. Going on my fourth year of university now. The reference our reading, where a book published and printed, the Open University, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes. First published in 2017. We're on the first unit. Bliss was in it that dawned to be alive. Page 1. Bliss was in it, dawned to be alive. The Trial of Exile of Thomas Muir. It's the aims of this unit. This unit will provide an overview of social, political and economic changes that occurred in Britain and Ireland during the period 1789 to 1840. Identify particular important events and process that you will consider in more detail in subsequent units in the block. Introduce you to a range of historical sources to enhance your understanding of how historians research and write about the past. We're on the introduction, page 6. Welcome to Block 1, Ambition and Anxiety, 1789 to 1840. These years witnessed unprecedented social, political and economic change, and arguably the birth of Britain and Ireland we recognise today. This opening unit explores historical contours of these turbulent decades, introducing topics that you will consider in more detail later in the block. In addition, you'll complete exercises that will help you start to understand how historians research history and why they sometimes disagree with one another. In section 1.1, I will introduce you to Thomas Muir, a Scottish lawyer tried for sedition, inciting people to rebel against the government in 1793 and transported to Australia as punishment. Muir's experiences in the 1790s provide a good lens through which to examine some of the changes already underway. At the start of this period, to refer back to the block's title, What Happened to Muir can show us the ambition that, I think, characterised the period: ambition for political reform, social freedom and industrial innovation, and also the anxiety, fear of disorder and resistance to change that sought to curb this enthusiasm. In section 1.2, you will consider the 1790s in a little more detail. What were Britain and Ireland like during this period? What seems familiar there, and what strikes us as surprisingly different from the Britain and Ireland of today? You'll then work through 3 sections and examine the key topic you encounter. In the rest of the book, section 1.3 introduces industrialisation and the rise of the working class. Explore in more detail units of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the working class. Units 2 and 3 respectively. Section 1 looks at new forms of knowledge and the growth of the state, which will be covered in turn by the units managing uncertainty. New forms of knowledge and the birth of the modern state, Unit 4 and 5. Sections 1 to 5, 1.5 explores the sometimes fractious relationship between England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and how Britain and Ireland were connected with the the wider world, covered by the units imagined, nation made real. And the British Isle and the Atlantic world, units 6 and 7 respectively. When you're finished studying the first unit, you should have basic grounding in the period of 1789 and 1840 so that you are well prepared for the detailed study of events and processes you will undertake later in the block. But if all that perhaps sounds rather daunting, let's begin with something small and contained, the fascinating trail and the surpassing adventures, overseas adventures of Tanya. Page 8, The Trial and Exile of Thomas More. Thomas More, 1764 and 1799, was born in Glasgow to parents who were comfortably well off and devout Christians. He studied law at university. By the later 1780s, he built a successful legal practice. More participated in General Assembly of the Church of Scotland as a church elder and become friends with loose advocates and land reform in Scotland. Dickinson's 2004. Many of those advocates, More included, were increasingly influenced by the new political ideas generated by the French Revolution, which began in 1789 and lasted until 1799. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, the social and political system existing within France prior to 1789, is usually referred to the ancient regime. Everyone was subject to the King of France and also a member of one of three orders of estates, the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else, the so-called third estate. All rights and status depend on which estate an individual was a member of. With the third estate, the comers have limited rights and privileges. By the 1770s, France was almost a populous country in Europe, and a new elite of wealthy commoners were beginning to aspire political power. Louis XII, 1754 and 1793, reigned in 1774-92, ascended to the throne in the midst of a series of economic crises precipitated by the cost of foreign wars and outmoded system of taxation and a succession of poor harvests. During the spring and summer of 1788, there was a popular unrest in many cities, and in early 1789, under pressure, the king convened the Estates General, the body that represented all three estates, for the first time since 1614. When it met, the Estates General was riven by division as to whether to vote by head, in which case the commoners would have a majority, or by estate, whereby the clergy and nobility could outvote the commoners. In June, they elected the third estate deputies. The state deputies themselves, a National Assembly suspicious of royal tyranny and aristocratic plotting. A Parisian crowd then seized the Bastille, a state prison. On 14th of July, there then followed what come to be known as the Great Fear, a period of panic and rioting during July and August. A new National Constituent Assembly subsequently abolished the last vestiges of feudalism, published the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, nationalised church lands, and reorganised the administrative structure of the French state. Louis XII tried to flee the country in 1791, but was brought back to Paris. In 1792, the first of the so-called Revolutionary Wars broke out against Austria, as those in power in France sought to protect themselves against outside intervention. So began a series of conflicts that would last until 1802. From September 1792, a new national convention abolished the monarchy, established a republic, condemned Louis XII and his wife, Mary Antoinette, 1755 to 1793, to death, raised an army of more than 1 million men and established the Reign of Terror, during which at least 300,000 people suspected of disloyalty to the new public were arrested, at least 17,000 of whom were executed. In 1794 to 95, a royalist white terror arose in reaction but was crushed eventually by the young general Napoleon Bonaparte. 1769-1821 reigned as emperor, 1804 to 1814, leading to rule by directory, a five-member committee during the period to 1799. Taken as a whole, the French Revolution had a huge impact on Europe and America, inspiring both aristocratic and conservative fears and liberal hopes for new forms of social and political freedom. The French Revolution, which resulted in the overthrow of the monarchy in France and the establishment of the Republic, was marked at times by extreme violence, but also inspired intellectuals and radicals around the world to challenge established forms of authority and to promote freedom, equality, and fraternity. If you have perhaps wondered about the quotation that forms the title of its unit, it is taken from a poem of William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850, expressing his feelings about the revolution. Many like him were inspired by changes set in motion by that event, which they hoped would sweep aside the meagre, stale, forbidden ways of custom, law, and statute. You will not vote, however, that I have added a question mark to the quotation in the unit title, as not everyone embraced calls for liberty, equality, and brotherhood, and many feared and resisted the notion of rapid social and political change. One of many to be inspired by the revolution, however, was Thomas More. But on page 10, in 1792, More played a leading part in setting up the Association of Friends of the People in Edinburgh. The political reform society was perhaps, to our eyes, far from the revolutionary. It required members to declare their allegiance to King and Parliament, and simply sought a full, fair, and equal representation of the people in Parliament. Mason and Jameson, 1923. In the light of the French Revolution, however, even such moderate demands seemed radical to the ruling elite in Westminster at the time. So when Muir, at a meeting of reformed societies in Scotland, read out a printed address from the Society of United Irishmen, another middle-class reformed society which would later become committed to ending English monarchical rule in Ireland. The authorities in Edinburgh began to suspect he was seeking to sow the seeds of rebellion. In January 1793, Muir was arrested on a charge of sedition, but was released on bail. He travelled to London and then on to Paris, where he attempted unsuccessfully to prevent the execution of Louis XII. Unfortunately for Muir, France declared war on Britain while he was there, and as he has no passport to leave the country, he missed his trial and was struck off as a lawyer in Scotland. Apparently, intending to emigrate to the United States, Muir then boarded a US ship bound for Boston, but left it again when it called at Dublin, travelling back to Scotland in July, where he was duly arrested again. Muir appeared in court on August 1793, charged with making seditious speeches, circulating seditious papers, and publicly reading out seditious writings. During his trial, he passionately but unwisely defended himself, making a 3-hour speech in which he declared, "I admit that I considered parliamentary reform to be essential to the salvation of my country. But I deny that I ever advised the people to accomplish that by any means which the construction did not sanction." Many witnesses also attested to Muir's constant exhortation to peaceful methods, but the presiding judge, Lord Braxfield, clearly biased, claimed in summary that a government in every country should be made up of the landed interest, which alone has a right to be represented. As for the rabble, who have nothing but personal property, who hold the nation of them, Braxfield sentenced Muir to transportation to Austria for 14 years, and similar sentences were handed down to the four others prominent in the reform movement. All five were transported on the Surprise, which set sail for New Holland, called at the point of May 1794. A copy of the indent ship paperwork setting out details of transportees. For the Surprise of is reproduced as figure the keen to thwart English plans wherever possible. The French Admiralty sent frigates to attempt Muir's rescue for the revolutionary cause, but could not locate the Surprise, which reached Sydney by way of Brazil on October 1794. Here, conditions were not as bad as might be expected. Muir was even provided with a farm in the country with convicts to work it for him. The governor wrote 1795 and Muir seemed to bear his circumstances with a proper degree of fortitude and resignation. Mason and Jameson, 1923. The following year, however, he escaped the colony and boarded a US ship and ended up at Monterey. There's a picture here with the California, a Spanish colony at the time, where he visited the governor there and wrote letters to all the soldiery, including George Washington, 1732-1799 US President, 1798, 89 to 97 from California. Muir eventually sailed to Mexico and then on towards Spain in 1797. When his ship was attacked by two British vessels towards the end of the voyage, war between Britain and Spain having broken out in 1796, he fought valiantly by the captain's side. Muir was injured by a flying splinter of deck, losing his left eye and part of his face, and was so disfigured that British troops looking for him on board did not recognise him, and he was sent ashore with the wounded. In subsequent weeks, French politicians, including Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, 1754-1838, himself a key figure in French foreign relations during this period, it pressed the Spanish to let Muir travel freely. During a period of war between France and Britain, it was obviously seen to be French interest to aid and abet individuals the British saw as troublesome. Muir eventually made his way to France, therefore, and worked free during a period when an invasion of England was being seriously considered, rekindling associations with the Society of United Irishmen and Thomas Paine, an English-American political figure, activist, and one of the founding fathers of the USA. In January 1799, however, Muir died aged just 34, his health broken by the arduous nature of his travels. So an interesting historical vignette, perhaps, but why I've chosen to open the first unit to the module by telling you about Thomas Muir? Well, the purpose of this unit is to introduce you to the period 1789 to 1840 as a whole. Muir's life and death hopefully serve to illustrate the rationale for the start date of the module, French Revolution of 1789, and also to show how dynamic and turbulent the 1790s were. We can look at the specimen exercise. Reflect on what you just read. Consider the following question. In what ways does Muir's story illustrate the significance of the French Revolution outside France? I'm going to jot down a few notes. Significant outside the French Revolution. Muir's experience illustrated the political aims embodied in the French Revolution. To end monarchical rule and to give the voice of will of the people inspired many in Britain and Ireland to seek political change. You yourselves were obviously galvanised by the revolution, but you have also read the above of the two political form societies which activities were charged by the energy of the revolution: the Association of Friends of the People and the Society of United Irishmen. You might also have noticed that the influence of the revolution was not confined to Britain and Ireland, as evidenced by Mer's contact with Thomas Paine in the US. Second, I hope you noted how these calls for change were seen as threatened by establishing authorities. Lord Braxfield, for example, who then sought to repress and prevent political and social innovation. Finally, you have spotted how the French Revolution had an effect on the international relations between France and Britain and Ireland. The French Revolution Wars, 1792-1802, which Britain joined from 1793, meant that France had a vested interest in disrupting British society. Its intent in this regard is manifest above in the French attempt to rescue Muir for transportation and allowing him refuge on his return from the United States so he could campaign on behalf of France and push for radical change in mainland Britain and Ireland. Even a brief dip in the 1790s is possible to miss the excitement and the fear of dangers in Britain and Ireland by events across the Channel. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772-1834, was also inspired by the Revolution that he reputedly burnt the words "Liberty and Equality" into lawns of Trinity College, Cambridge, Pains of Rights of Man, 1791, which argued that the popular revolution permissible, yet a government did not safeguard the natural rights of its citizens. This was deemed so incendiary that printing it or passing it on to others was a crime, whilst historians and sometimes wary of periodization, dividing historical time into periods that are seen to have distinct properties or characteristics. Many do see the French Revolution as a point of departure from which political and social change accelerated. The case of Mer demonstrates how connected Britain and Ireland were to the rest of the world. Historical evidence left by networks of trade and diplomacy means that it is relatively easy to reconstruct Mer's travels. He is able to write letters and send them all over the world with confidence that they would eventually arrive. Partly due to the bureaucratic record keeping of Spanish diplomats, we even know that he accompanied letters to his friends, all about ill health. But when writing to his parents, assured them he was fine. A bright lie we can all perhaps identify with. News of his injury at sea and subsequent death was reported swiftly in newspapers. The world in the 1790s were more interconnected than we might imagine, particularly across the historians that have called the Atlantic world. The territories of North and South America, Europe and Africa that border Atlantic and movement of people, commodities, and idea across the Atlantic world shaped the course of events in Britain and Ireland too. What I aim to demonstrate in the rest of this unit, and indeed the block as a whole, is how the seed of Victorian era was to come was sown in the foundational period, ambitious innovation and striving part of many to create a new and better world, mingled with manner of public concerns and discontents, as the block's title suggests. This was indeed a period of ambition and anxiety in equal measure. Now to go to the module website and complete how historians study history. This should take around an hour. I, anyway, we're on page 16, Britain and Ireland in the 1790s. I covered a lot of ground in section 1.1, so don't worry if you feel you've not quite grasped everything. You'll come back to all the ideas and themes I've mentioned, both later in this unit and elsewhere in the block. Now, though, I would like you to consider 1790s, an important decade and a gateway to the rest of the module. In a little more detail, what were Britain and Ireland like at this point in time? What do you think our image of Britain and Ireland were around like around 1800s. I want to be very clear that this is no way a test of your knowledge. Even if you have know nothing at all about Britain Island in this period, you can still complete the exercise. Or, as historians, it is important that we are consciously aware of our perceptions and beliefs about the topics we study, so that we can avoid bringing preconceived hypotheses to our study of the past. When starting to think about big questions like this, it can be helpful to structure your thoughts under different headings. So I would suggest that you use headings relating to those adopted below: population, economy, and politics. Under each heading, write anything down you know about Britain and Ireland in this period. If you know nothing at this point, then think about your assumptions, perhaps drawn from historic drama on television. Ask yourself questions to get yourself thinking going. What percentage of the population lived in towns and cities, for example, or how democratic was politics during the period? There is no right answer to this exercise, which is why I've supplied a specimen paper. The aim is to supply to get you to interrogate your knowledge and assumptions of the period. Make sure you keep the notes you make, because you will need to refer back to them at the end of this session. So in the 1800s, the population, economy, and politics in the 1800s. Uh, anyway, population and urban and rural life. All I know is 1980s of England and Ireland. At the start of 1790s, England and Ireland were still primarily rural, while London was already predominant as one of the largest cities in the world, with a population approaching 1 million. And while 40% of the British population did live in towns and cities, a greater proportion than any of the other northern European country, majority of people still lived and worked in either small towns and villages. Clark, 2000, page 4. In England, apart from London, there were no cities with over 1,000 inhabitants, the next largest being Manchester, with a population of 90,000 in 1800. In Scotland, the largest city was Glasgow, with a population of 77,000 in 1801, and Wales, with Swansea, with a population of 6,000 inhabitants in the 1790s. In Ireland, Dublin was already a major city, with inhabitants numbering around 187 in 1804. Dickinson and wrote in 2014. But most of the rest of the country was rural as most of Britain, if not more so. As late as 1840, fewer than 40% of the Irish population lived in towns more than 2,000 inhabitants. Hope in 2013 said, significance of the size of the rural population was not just one of the distribution, however. In Britain and Ireland, there had traditionally been a close connection between land ownership and social status. The place of the 200 or so aristocratic families at the apex of British society remained assured, but in addition to these, the landed gentry, around 12,000 to 13 families at this point, owned around half the land in England at the start of the 1790s. Evans, 1983, page 8. The landed gentry were not necessarily aristocrats. We had inherited their wealth, men of business. At this point, we are primarily talking about men rather than women engaging in business, often sought to buy into landed estates. This in turn could lead to political influence, as land ownership often brought with it to chance to purchase a seat in Parliament. At this time, it also brought considerable social responsibility in the form of customary duties. 1790s were far from a static, however, and change gathering pace in both rural and urban areas. Underpinning this change was rapidly rising population. Population figures from the first national census in 1801 may seem low when compared to the 2011 figures, except the case of Ireland, but the lack of overall growth is striking. But they reflected a 25% rise in 1750, double the European average.